Here's the question. I have 25 standards. How do I teach them all in the year? Okay, maybe you don't have 25. You have how many ever you have. But that is the reality. You have so many standards, and you might be feeling like, I have all of these standards. I don't know how I'm supposed to teach them all in 1 year. Before we get into that, let me introduce myself for those of you who aren't familiar. My name is Nicole Van Tassel, and I am creator of this group and founder of I Explore Academy, I Explore Science and I Explore Academy, where I provide professional development for teachers who are transitioning to the NGSS and three-dimensional instruction. So today we're going to be talking about bundling the standards, because that's really how we address this question and this challenge of all of these standards, not enough time. So the reality is, the way we used to teach isolated topics, moving chapter by chapter and addressing one standard at a time. We would typically have our state standards, and they would be mapped out, and we would have a unit that would address one standard at a time, and a lot of times we aligned it to our actual chapters. So we'd spend 1 week on this chapter, 1 week on that chapter, 1 week on the next chapter. Now, if you've been following along with storylines and all of that, you know that we are no longer using this chapter by chapter approach, right? We want to have these integrated, cohesive storylines. In the same way, our actual standards are integrated in a cohesive way as well. And this helps us address the problem of, how do we cover all of this content? Because the reality is, like, raise your hand here or drop a GIF or an emoji or something. If you have ever run out of time at the end of the year and not finished all the chapters that were assigned to you, I will honestly say I don't think I've ever fully completed my scope and sequence. I'm pretty sure I've always had to cut something, because there's simply not enough time to do that. I mean, your students, if you spend a little bit of extra time here, or you have this interruption there, those snow days, this pandemic, or even that assembly, or whatever it is, we realistically don't finish the chapter by chapter approach. Or if we do, we are rushing through it and we're not really spending like quality time learning it, right? So I'm sure, yeah, we've all been there, right? So we want to move away from that approach and move toward actually spending quality time addressing these standards. And the way that you do that is by bundling your standards and grouping them together. So bundling literally means like grouping them. And basically in a single unit, so maybe you're going to spend 3 weeks on a unit or a month on a unit, instead of spending that amount of time on one standard, or even half that amount of time on one standard and rushing through it or something, you are going to choose 2 or 3 standards that work together and spend that time addressing all 3 of those standards or all 2 of those standards. So it saves you time. Well, first of all, it's integrating the topics. So students are going to, there's a lot of value to this. I guess let me say that first. Part of the value is that it's integrating the topics. So students are actually seeing how these disparate ideas connect. They're understanding how photosynthesis ties into the food chain. Instead of learning about photosynthesis in its own unit, they are learning about how photosynthesis helps to transfer matter and energy in an ecosystem. Okay, that's one way maybe that you're integrating it. Along those lines, it's also helping you save time, because you're teaching multiple performance expectations, multiple disciplinary core ideas and the associated performance expectations at the same time. So you're saving time, and I'm going to show you an example in a second. And when you go to your assessment, you are assessing multiple performance expectations potentially at the same time. So you're not spending a day or 2 days on an assessment for each individual performance expectation. You're spending a day or 2 days, depending on how you formatted your assessment, on an assessment that knocks out 2 or maybe even 3 performance expectations. So the NGSS are designed to be taught in cohesive storylines. Like I said earlier, and if you've been following along with us for the last month or whatever, You know that, right? So the storylines are meant to address multiple performance expectations. They are meant to be tied around a phenomenon. So it makes sense if we are rethinking how science instruction should be taught. When science instruction is about explaining a phenomenon, a single standard alone just isn't going to be able to do it, right? If my phenomenon is the Atacama Desert in bloom, the Atacama is the driest desert in the world. It like literally never ever rains there. But every so often, there's just this enormous, like, not enormous, like this amazing bloom of all of these desert flowers. Like, people take pictures and it's just, this desert becomes covered in flowers. What causes that to happen? That is something that a single standard cannot explain. To explain that, to fully explain that phenomenon, students need to understand the water cycle. They need to understand, how did water even get there? It's a desert. And why isn't water there normally? They need to understand the impacts of water, of resource availability. Maybe they need to understand adaptations that allow those seeds to stay dormant for like extended periods of time. Maybe you don't, I mean, there's like a lot of factors that you could potentially tie in. It doesn't mean you have to tie in every single one of those factors. But you would identify a few factors that students do need to know, or that you want students to know, and those are the standards that you're teaching in that unit. So you are grouping those standards together so that students are getting a much more well-rounded understanding of the standards themselves, the core ideas of the phenomenon that you're using as a vehicle to understand those core ideas. And it's like a much more authentic understanding as well. So bundling is necessary from that perspective as we rethink science instruction as not just memorizing a bunch of facts, but actually explaining what's happening in the real world. But it's also necessary when we think of the logistics of our classroom and the time that is spent on things. Another example is climate and the water cycle. In my unit on organisms and their environments, I tie together climate, the water cycle, weather, and some resource availability and things like that. But after students have spent some time learning about the water cycle, they are so much better prepared for lessons that are related to climate and weather. And if I had taught those as completely separate units, it would have been much more difficult for my students to, especially if I had taught them like totally different times, it would have been much more difficult for my students to connect what they learned with the water cycle to help them understand climate and weather. But because it is one big bundled storyline, we are constantly going back to what we've learned about the water cycle and bringing it into understanding climate, and then understanding weather, and understanding how climate and weather are connected as well. So by bundling those three ideas and those three standards together, my students are understanding better. I'm saving time because, again, I'm not going into weather and climate and reteaching the water cycle. No, it's literally part of this whole unit. And as my students are learning about climate and weather and so on and so forth, they are learning and reviewing and reiterating and even being assessed on elements that they've learned before on like the water cycle. So bundling is a way to save yourself time in the classroom. So the first step when you're kind of mapping out your curriculum and you're thinking about your scope and sequence and how do I cover all of these standards, if you're thinking about it as like a week to week thing and you're like, I'm going to cover this standard, that standard, stop that. First of all, look at groups. You don't have to make big groups. It doesn't have to be like 6, 7, 8 standards at a time. See if you can match up 2, maybe 3 standards together. Start there. 2 to 3 standards. See if you can connect them and teach those in little bundled units. It's going to save you time. It's going to help your students understand the cohesiveness of science as a discipline. It's going to help you when you're choosing phenomena because it's a lot easier to kind of narrow down relevant phenomena when you have a couple more variables to take into account. And it just makes like the learning much more authentic. So your solution to basically not enough time is you really have to start with bundling your standards. If you have any questions about bundling, please reach out, post them below. This is one topic that we cover in much more depth in iExplore Academy. It's basically your first step in mapping out your cohesive curriculum. a lot of times states and districts will give you the standards for your year, but they're not giving you like the breakdown of your units. And so breaking, your 12 or 20 or however many standards you have into your actual unit bundles is really where you need to start before you can dive into actual unit planning. So if you have questions about that process, if you have quick questions, I'm happy to answer them. Post them below. I can definitely direct you to some resources that are out there. Again, if you have more in-depth questions, iExplore Academy goes like super in-depth into this topic. If you are just, however, like, okay, bundling, that's great, but what are you talking about with storylines and the NGSS and 3 dimensions? And I don't know what you're talking about. This is a different language. Go back and start with Kickstart AHA, or Intro to the NGSS mini course. That's a totally free, like delivered by email workshop series. It's 4 days. You can just like even listen to it while you're walking your dog or something. And it will give you a good introduction to 3-dimensional learning. And it's just a great place to start. Thank you for hanging with me today. If you have any questions, reach out. We will we'll be talking about bundling next week too. So we'll go a little bit more in depth into like how you can be integrating different topics into your bundling, especially if you're discipline specific and like different types of bundling. But my takeaway for you today is just when you're planning your units, don't just pick one standard at a time. Try to match up at least 2 standards. Again, it's going to save you time. It's going to make the learning more authentic. It's going to make it easier to find phenomena to explain. If you have questions, reach out. Thanks, guys.